It is dry. I'm gonna take it down. 1 second.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. I will bring us into our presentation for the day. My name is Noah Maturko with People for Bikes, and welcome to our virtual education series. Today's session is brought to you by the Sustainability Working Group. Today, we're focused on sustainability compliance. As I mentioned, I'm Noah Maturko. I'm our Senior Manager of State and Local Policy here at People for Bikes. We're going to do a quick overview of the agenda for this session, and then we'll pass it over to our featured speaker. I would say a cool thing about today is we're going to have lots of time for interactive discussion, so keep that in mind. So sustainability compliance is the topic, and I'm going to go over some of the issues that we're going to drill into a little bit here today. Um, and after we pass it to our featured speaker, James Pollock, we are going to be able to drill into any of the questions that you may have. So throughout the entire presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A tab rather than the chat. James will do a short deep dive in several topic areas, but the benefit of this discussion, as I mentioned, is the ability to ask the questions, address any roadblocks. If you have any speed bumps or we didn't cover something you'd like to, just drop it in the Q&A and we'll have an open discussion on that. So we have about 15 minutes to 20 minutes at the end for that discussion, and we will get into it. So you all know People for Bikes, hopefully. Um, People for Bikes is the U.S. bicycle industry's trade association. We know that bikes make the world great. Our big audacious goal is to make the U.S. the best place in the world to ride a bike, and sustainability is a key part of that. So we are the Sustainability Working Group. Our goal is to advance tactical initiatives to achieve environmental, health, and corporate sustainability goals for the bike industry and our partners. We support People for Bikes members, companies, individuals, and company efforts to operate more sustainably by providing education, guidance, and opportunities to collaborate on shared issues. I think we're long past, we know that bicycles themselves are a sustainable mode of transportation, but our goal is to make sure that the production and everything that goes into that is also sustainable to complement that. And to do that, our work is guided by 4 key issue areas: climate action, circular economy, sustainability compliance, which is what we're talking about today, and responsible supply chains. So the Sustainability Working Group has about 80 members across 45 brands. We're always looking to grow and share your experience. We do these quarterly meetings. Sometimes these are our big group webinars, and a lot of you on the meeting today might not be a part formally of the Sustainability Working Group. Other times they are more they're always open meetings, but they're smaller, so we can drill in. The best way to stay in the loop on this is to message me, drop in the chat, or email me at noah@peopleforbikes.org saying you would like to be a member of the Sustainability Working Group. So as I mentioned earlier, our work is guided by sustainability issues prioritized by you, our members, and we always want to reflect that. And I want to mention today that we've heard a lot about sustainability compliance from our members over the past 6 months. And that's why we wanted to host this today, to make sure that you know what's on the horizon for compliance regulations, what's new for 2026, and then yet you're feeling looped in. There can be a lot going on. It can be hard to feel like you know exactly the steps you're supposed to be taking or what applies to your company. And we're not going to get to everything today, but our goal is to make sure that you're feeling like you know what the landscape is. And this slide clearly lays out the purpose and the values of Sustainability Working Group. Our goal is to set the table for what the working group does, the values we are guided by, and the value we create for you, which is the ability to educate, share resources, collaborate. So here is a little bit of what we're going to cover today. James may have a little bit more, and we're gonna leave it to him to lead the discussion how he sees fit. He's a pro, he does this all the time. But I thought some things we would cover would be SB 261, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and this is one that requires large companies doing business in California to disclose their climate-related financial risks and adaptation measures every other year, starting next year. We also have the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. We have the California embedded battery regulations, and this is a new one that's going into effect in 2026, and there's been a lot of questions around that too. We have the packaging components, source reduction, packaging components and source reduction act as well. And then we'll have a couple of others, but I want you to take a moment, and if none of these have been, if there are other issues that you would like to cover in addition to these, I want you to drop those into the chat, and we'll make sure we circle back during our group discussion. So I'm going to hold for about 60 seconds while I let you all do that. And then we will kick it over to James. So take a look at this list. There's going to be some other things. But if there's anything in this list that you've been having questions about or hitting roadblocks while trying to meet those regulatory requirements or just fill out the paperwork or anything like that, drop those notes in the chat. If there's anything that's not on this list that you would really love for us to cover, drop that in the chat as well, and we'll hopefully have time to cover all that. So I'll just give us a couple more seconds to do that. Okay, I'm going to relinquish the power here and toss it over to James to take over whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Noah. I really appreciate the kind introduction and hope to live up to it. Uh, as Noah mentioned, please do throw questions or comments into the chat or the Q&A function. I've been able to get those up here, and so I'm able to sort of keep track, and I know Noah's going to be helpful on that as well. It's really great to speak with you all and such a large group focused on these sustainability regulations and these compliance issues that it does seem like are growing quite a bit in recent years. As a very brief introduction, my name is James Pollock. I'm an attorney at Martin Law. We're an environmental law firm, which means we're a boutique that focuses on a specific niche, environmental law in particular. Um, I work with brands and retailers on sort of this growing set of what I like to describe as sustainability regulations that encompass a pretty large set of regulations going into effect, some of which Noah has mentioned, and he sent those over to me in advance. I pulled together a short deck to just talk through, at least a table set, but really interested to hear what folks are thinking about and issues that are coming up for you. Let me just make sure that my cursor, there we go. So I sometimes get the question, especially in the legal community, what exactly is it that you are doing, or what are these sustainability laws that you're talking about? It's a really fascinating developing field. There have been a number of these laws in place in different jurisdictions, but we're starting to see sort of this unified picture of what sustainability regulations look like and how they operate. They cover each stage of your operations, and as a result, I think there are a few there are a few stakeholders within organizations that are really well positioned to take them on, and those are cross-functional parts of your organization, folks like your sustainability team, your compliance team, or if you have it, your legal team. And the reason for that is that those teams have to touch on each of these different pieces of your business. There are regulations governing sourcing, what types of materials you use, how you can use them. And that ranges from chemical regulations to mandates to use recycled inputs or things like that, ensuring that materials that you use do not implicate deforestation in the EU. At the next level is manufacturing regulations. So, to the extent that you have your own manufacturing operations, ensuring EHS regulations are followed, but also manufacturing is where a lot of your emissions are probably derived. And so, to the extent that you have climate targets or things like that, your manufacturing practices are really an important driver for your scope emissions. Next are your commercial relationships. So, requirements that retailers may be setting for brands or that brands may be setting for their suppliers, and how those agreements incorporate the different features of these laws. So, how are you going to share data about where your products end up or what the inputs into your products are? Those are, or how do you notify someone that you've discovered a product is no longer compliant in a particular jurisdiction? Each of these things are related to your commercial interactions with folks up and downstream. There's, of course, implications on people, and I mentioned, environmental and health regulations. That's a really important part of the discussion, and we want to make sure that people and people's health are present in those types of discussions. We have marketing, and marketing is sometimes siloed within an organization, may not be in conversation with product development or sustainability. Um, and ensuring that representations follow the law, whether they're representations about your products or about your business practices. There is an emerging set of regulations saying you can or cannot make these representations, or this is the type of substantiation you need to make this kind of representation. And so ensuring that those are compliant and there's kind of its own set of requirements when it comes to sustainability attributes. And then finally, product end of life. And how do you deal with things like batteries or packaging or primary product like textiles at the end of life? And what kinds of fees do you have to pay for those through things like EPR, extended producer responsibility laws that are going into effect? And ultimately, how are those products or packaging or other materials reused and they feed back into your products and your sourcing? So there are laws that touch on each aspect of sort of a product's life cycle. And having that holistic view is really helpful because it touches on each of these. And in talking to Noah, I mean, each of these could be its own presentation. And so I had to be selective about what I cover. In talking to Noah, I realized that there was kind of a pattern with the ones that he was mentioning that members had brought forward, and that's the great state of California as sort of a focus of regulation. California isn't the only state adopting these laws, and I don't intend for this presentation to be myopic in focus. There are regulations going into effect in Washington State, where I sit, Oregon, New York, in the EU, in Canada, that touch on any number of these topics that I'm going to mention. But it's worth just drilling into a little bit more detail on these ones because a lot of them have either gone into effect or will soon go into effect. They're demonstrative of these trends more broadly, and they're just a useful starting place for us to talk, especially because most folks do business in California. So this is sort of the basic agenda, and please do drop questions, comments into the chat. And Noah, if you see anything, just feel free to break in. I'm always happy to have that.
Awesome. Thanks, James.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started with SB 261. This is the Climate Related Financial Risk Act, or folks tend to just call it SB 261. This law was passed alongside SB 253, which I'll talk about next, back in 2023. And this pair of laws really addresses climate change disclosure requirements. So, a need to disclose certain aspects of your business, whether public or private, relating to climate change. In this case, it only covers companies with total annual revenues in excess of $500 million dollars that do business in California, which has its own definition. And there are regulations governing, how do you account for that $500 million dollars when there are parent companies and subsidiaries that you have to kind of dive into. But the disclosure is specifically to climate related financial risks. This once every 2 year disclosure, it may be the first time, especially for private companies, privately held companies, that they're disclosing any of these kinds of risks. Some public companies may have already been doing so voluntarily or through other jurisdictions or as a part of their existing financial reporting. But this is specific to climate related financial risk, and it points to existing voluntary guidelines uh, governing how you compile those kinds of reports, what's included, what do they look like, how do you assess them. Um, those regulations are largely in development as we speak. There was actually a regulatory update. Some draft regulations came out just 2 days ago. I haven't fully gone through them yet, but just know that this is an existing law with draft regulations under development. The original deadline was January 1st, 2026 for these reports. That was going to be the mandatory deadline to file with the state as well as publicly post those reports about financial risk. Um, that deadline is now has now been pushed back, and it's slightly uncertain when the final deadline will be. That's because there's been a lawsuit filed just a couple of years ago, actually, challenging this law, and there was an injunction filed. That means the court intervened and said, "Hey, state agency, you cannot enforce this law until we've had arguments and made a full decision about the law itself." That injunction is now in place. CARB, the agency, the California agency that is implementing this law, has put out an enforcement advisory saying that they will not enforce the law against any parties that do not voluntarily report their climate risk. They have made the platform available to folks, and so that platform is live for voluntary reports. Um, there will be a hearing in January on the injunction, so keep an eye out for updates on this and how it will go. But just know that it's currently on hold, and folks should be aware of that in their own planning. We can go ahead to the next one. And if there are questions that arise with each of these laws, again, post them in the Q&A in the chat. SB 253 is kind of the companion law to 261. SB 253 is different in that it, instead of dealing with climate related financial risks, so these effects of climate change are going to impact our business in these ways in the future. We've adopted these governance techniques in order to respond to those risks or things like that. This law really focuses on disclosure of emissions information, specifically scope 1 and 2 emissions in 2026 and scope 3 emissions a year later, so 2027. It covers a slightly narrower group of companies, those companies with over $1 billion in revenue, in annual revenue, doing business in California. So it uses that same definition for a jurisdictional hook. Now, for these entities, again, it covers public and private companies. It also has to be the reports themselves have to be independently verified. And the requirements for that kind of independent verification and the content of those reports is contained in those regulations under development right now. Note that the deadline for filing is August 10th, 2026. The injunction that I mentioned with the last law does not cover this law. It's possible that there will be future filings seeking an injunction against this law as well. Um, but the court, for the moment, has declined to grant an injunction preventing this law from going into effect. So that deadline is the current deadline. And CARB again has been putting out quite a bit of information about what these disclosures look like. Here are worksheets that you can use, and they've put out a number of FAQs and webinars on the topic. But this would be the first US based climate disclosure law of this kind of scope. There are some more limited ones, like here in Washington State, covering folks related to the energy sector. This is a really broadly scoped law that covers any public and private entities above that threshold. So the idea for folks who have a potential obligation here, keep tracking these requirements, the regulatory developments, as well as the court cases to see where they go in the future. All right, a little bit of a departure here, and this moves from reporting and climate related laws here in the States to labeling laws and green regulations, green marketing regulations. For folks who are making sustainability claims about their products, they're probably really familiar with a number of requirements that have been in effect for years now. The primary sort of source of truth, the North Star, has been the FTC's green guides, which haven't been updated for quite a few years. I think the most recent one is 2012. Um, the green guides provide guidance on federal interpretation of what would or would not deceive a reasonable consumer when you're making a sustainability claim. So you're saying this product is recyclable. It has a definition for what recyclability looks like. You're saying that this product is free of PFAS or free of lead. Well, what does that mean? The FTC Green Guides actually provide guidance on what you can reasonably make a free of claim based on. States, in the absence of this kind of federal activity or federal updates on sustainability, uh, states have stepped in and have adopted a number of different laws governing general claims of sustainability. How do you make general claims and not deceive consumers? And what kind of information do you need to have on file? Um, they've also adopted laws governing specific claims, things like biodegradability. That's been a huge point of focus, as well as recyclability has been a major focus. And California is a great example of this. So SB 343, which was enacted back in 2021, it targets inaccurate use of labeling that indicates a product is recyclable or environmentally sustainable or compostable or biodegradable. It sets out standards to make those kinds of claims. It, in particular, prohibits someone from using labeling on a product or on packaging that it's recyclable using those chasing arrow symbols unless the items are regularly collected and processed for recycling in the state. And it's interesting because this law interconnects with another law that I'll talk about shortly, the packaging EPR law in California. California has done extensive research on materials used in packaging and has actually made determinations about what packaging materials are recyclable under this more strict collection and processing standard. So the federal standard had to do, you could say, this packaging is recyclable if a certain percentage of the population had access within a geographic region to a recycling facility that could theoretically process that material or would collect that material. California sets a higher bar for what is considered recyclable, and they've conducted that analysis for packaging materials at least. So you can actually go online, you can find that list and go through and see is this particular material we're making a claim is recyclable? Does it meet California's definition? Or are we at risk of potentially deceiving consumers? And there are some that are really obvious, like cardboard turns out is in fact recyclable under that definition. But there are some non-obvious materials and especially blended materials and composite packaging, things that have plastic laminates or other layers in them, where it may or may not be recyclable depending on the state's determination. So something to be aware of along with those requirements is that this law also creates an interesting obligation for folks who are making these kinds of claims to maintain written documentation showing that, let's say that you're making a biodegradability claim. You need to have documentation on hand substantiating that claim. So testing or other types of materials that substantiate that claim, and that those materials can actually be requested by the public. So anyone can reach out and say, "Hey, I saw this on your label. Can you provide me with the information?" And so that provides a really interesting new wrinkle to this kind of activity, something to be aware of as you're looking to make these kinds of claims about different materials you use, whether in your packaging or in other aspects of your business. Noah, I'm seeing some activity in the chat. Are you able to summarize?
Yes, we can jump into that. So this is from Mark. We'll go into it. So the question is, how does a supplier stay current on individual states as opposed to having a cohesive national standard? There's a little bit more context. It seems to be California is a good baseline. Other states can go further. Deadlines have seemed to be flexible, and the exact implementation date can be a moving target. How much responsibility do suppliers have to their larger customer for reporting?
It's a really great set of questions here. And I think this federal state interaction is something worth pausing on and talking about. I mention it very briefly in the context of the green guides, but you can really apply that same logic or that same tension to packaging regulations, to an EPR, to chemical regulations, to any number of regulatory regimes that we're talking about today. The absence of federal activity, we're seeing this patchwork quilt effect, where different states are adopting different standards with different deadlines that make it really hard from a market access perspective to figure out what you should be doing. Um, as far as how to keep track, it's really hard. I will say, even as someone who's a practitioner in this space, it is very difficult. I do think that there are some rules of thumb that you can apply and sort general sources of truth that can be really useful. And it depends on the context, like what kinds of regulations we're talking about. So if we're talking about EPR, for example, which we'll talk about in a minute, um, there's really only one entity that has taken on the mantle of a producer responsibility organization, the Circular Action Alliance. So if you're looking for a centralized hub to understand, what are the general requirements around reporting materials for packaging EPR, CAA is a great resource because they end up covering all the states that are currently active in the US. When you're talking about chemical management, that's a totally different ballgame. I wouldn't go to CAA for that, but there are entities out there that are doing great work providing public information, attempting to provide guidance on how to meet international and national state level regulations around chemistry. So you can look at industry standard restricted substance lists, and some that encompass not only soft goods but hard goods, like the Affirm list does a great job AFIRM. It does a great job of sort of setting out what are the different standards for chemistry use that enable continued market access, and they show, what jurisdictions they're sort of matching those requirements to. So if you're talking about a lead standard for metal, what are they tying that to, and why is it the standard that they set? Um, so it's not a clean answer. It really depends on the particular type of regulation that we're talking about. But the challenge is those obligations, it's not always clear who it falls on. And depending on the law, it can fall on the retailer. And then depending on the contract with the retailer, it may fall on the brand as a result of the retailer's activity, or same with brands to suppliers, or a brand may be liable under chemical management regime, but the retailer failed to warn, and it really becomes very fact specific. So it's hard to answer it in a broad way that's really satisfying. Um, what it requires is communication, providing documentation, clarifying those relationships in your contracts. And so, to the extent that, let's say that you're a brand, setting clear expectations for your suppliers. Same with retailers communicating with brands. And some of the best interactions that I've seen across any number of these laws have been suppliers raising issues with brands. The brand may not be aware of a requirement that's coming up, but you may have other customers that you're working with who are aware of something. Raising that with your other customers, that can be an immensely useful tool to ensure everyone is working on the same playing field, and that your compliance efforts in one arena are rewarded in others as well. Look at the affirmative steps that we're taking here. I hope that helps.
That was great. Thanks, James.
All right. So this truth in recycling law, just know that there are other states that have adopted very similar laws. Washington State, Minnesota, several other states have adopted kind of their own versions of these things. Um, California's in this case is the most robust. And so looking at that, especially for these specific types of claims like recyclability, biodegradability, um, biodegradability has been a very regulated space when it comes to plastics and whether you can even make a biodegradability claim with a plastic. So worth taking a look there at your marketing materials, especially about your packaging, and making sure that you're compliant, and uh, that you're compliant going forward. This is a bit of a diversion from here. I'm actually realizing I'm going to go out of order. Let's see. This will be easier to talk in this direction. Let's talk about SB 54 before we get into batteries. So SB 54 is the packaging EPR law in California. EPR is it's a policy mechanism that's been applied to a number of different product areas. And it's worth getting familiar with to the extent that you aren't yet, which I'm sure many of you are. It requires, or the goal of EPR as a framework is to put responsibility for waste or the end of life of a product on the producers of that product. So, really easy example that exists in a number of different states, mattress EPR. I know that I paid a fee on my mattress at the front end as a customer that will help fund mattress pickup at the end of the life of this mattress. I know that there's a number I can call within my state. Someone will pick it up and will properly dispose of the mattress. We'll collect it, dismantle it, and those parts can then, at least in theory, be reused. This policy framework is now being applied to a number of different products as well as packaging in a number of different states. California, it's worth highlighting, but folks who are likely aware of this are because Oregon was a first mover here, followed by Colorado, California, Minnesota, Maine, Maryland, Washington State. We're really seeing this policy approach being applied to packaging at a broad level that we haven't seen with other product types. And the implications are much broader because everyone uses packaging. So, producers of covered materials, in this case, packaging, have to join a producer responsibility organization. And this third party entity, which, as I mentioned before, Circular Action Alliance, is then responsible for collecting reporting data on the amount of packaging being put to market and collecting fees based on that packaging put to market, and then using those fees to fund end of life infrastructure, recycling, collecting, sorting, those kinds of things. And that is packaging EPR in a nutshell. You might be wondering who's responsible for the packaging or who's the producer. One of the challenges with messaging on this is that it doesn't cover packaging manufacturers necessarily. It's the folks who use packaging for their products that are the manufacturers of that packaging. There's kind of a cascading definition in this law. Primarily, it's if you're a brand and you have branded packaging on your product, you are likely responsible for that packaging. If you're a retailer that then takes that and puts it into another box, the retailer is responsible for the other box. The brand is responsible for the underlying packaging of the product. So there's a division there that implies a need for data sharing because you need to understand where those products are going and whether they're going into California. CAA has provided methodologies that you can use to estimate the amount of product going into a state. But those estimation methodologies are just that, they're estimates. And over time, if we can look at other jurisdictions that have implemented EPR, like Canada, that kind of estimation methodology may go out of favor over time. And so you need to be increasingly aware of where your products are going and how they're getting there. Part of why I want to highlight California in particular with EPR, even though invoices have been issued and fees collected in Oregon, and invoices should soon be issued in Colorado, is because California has enacted a number of additional requirements beyond just reporting the amount of packaging you put out to market and then collecting fees. They also have required source reduction and source composition changes. So, as part of the initial baseline reporting that was due in November of 2025, that baseline included a count of the amount of plastic that the entity used from a pound perspective, but also from a component count perspective. So, how many plastic components are there in your packaging? And the purpose for that is the source reduction targets embedded into the law. So, by 2027, California mandates a 10% reduction of single-use plastics. By 2020 or by 2030, a 20% reduction of single-use plastics. And by 2032, a 25% reduction in single-use plastics. Those reductions are keyed off of the 2023 baseline data that was collected back in November of 25. So just know that those source reduction targets are there. The purpose is to reduce the amount of plastic entering the waste stream. And along with that, there is also a mandate that recycling rates go up. So the amount of stuff that's actually being recycled go up in step. And that by 2032, all single-use packaging has to be recyclable or compostable. Again, California has put out that list of what packaging is considered compostable or recyclable. There's a column for recyclable, a column for compostable. To the extent that you're using packaging that is not recyclable or compostable, that packaging can no longer be used after 2032. So one of two things needs to change. Either the recycling system needs to do a better job of recycling that particular material, or you need to change materials. And so that's going to be an action forcing set of deadlines that you got to keep aware of and keep track of, especially for things like poly bags or those kinds of like plastic film materials that California has determined are not recyclable at this point. The question is, will they become recyclable by 2032, or will you have to find alternatives by 2032? All right,
James, I'm
I'm
just
gonna.
going to do a quick time check. We're at 2:40. We can keep cooking. I think we had till 2:45 and we can go a few
Oh,
minutes over.
that's helpful to
Um,
know. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. And we haven't had any other questions pop up. But maybe I think 12:15 is definitely a good one to cover. And then we can sort of see if folks have questions. Does that work?
That sounds perfect, and I think that's actually the last one.
Great. Thanks, James.
Um, I wanted to give an extraordinarily brief shout out, and this will be in the slide deck to SB 707, which is EPR for textiles. And so, to the extent that your business also works in apparel, for example, know that EPR is moving over to textiles. And so be aware of that with deadlines starting next year. We're going to start seeing movement in that respect. But the last one that Noah wanted to make sure that I mentioned was 1215. This Electronic Waste Recycling Act went into effect in 2022. It requires retailers to start collecting fees for products that contain embedded batteries starting January 1st, 2026. So it's coming up quite soon. And in order to do that, retailers have to be aware of what products contain those embedded batteries. So there's an obligation on the part of brands or manufacturers to provide that kind of information to retailers. We've seen that being done in a number of different ways. I've seen brands posting on their websites disclosures on the types of products, affirmatively sending information to retailers as well about the products covered by this law. So that representation needs to come from the brand to the retailer so that the retailer can start to collect those fees that ultimately will feed into the collection and recycling infrastructure for these batteries. This is what's known as like a stewardship or a product stewardship law, and we're seeing similar things getting adopted in other states as well. Um, and there's some reporting requirements as well that are covered in this law that I note here at the bottom. But I think that covers the full scope of what I was hoping to cover there, Noah.
That was fantastic, James. And I think you've done such an incredible and in-depth job that beyond Mark's great question earlier, we don't have any questions in the chat right now, but now we do have a few minutes if folks wanted to drill in a little bit more to any of those, so we can save that time. Um, we'll let folks know that this meeting is going to be recorded and we can share this probably tomorrow with everybody who registered. And along with that, we'll have our slide decks as well. So those will be resources too. And then I can certainly be available. I will drop my email um, into the chat. So if folks have additional questions, let's see, you can always follow up with me. We have another question. It's what will the process look like for establishing eco-modulation rules for EPR frameworks? Thanks for that.
That is a great question. So it depends on which EPR framework we're talking about. A lot of these eco-modulation, well, so some of these eco-modulation, for those who are not in the know, eco-modulation are changes to fees based off of the use of particular materials or assessments of those materials that create discounts So it can be less fees under an EPR regime or malice fees. So you're actually using a much worse type of packaging, and so we're going to add additional uh, 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 fee to your invoice because of the type of material you're using. So there's benefit and potential cost associated with eco-modulation. A lot of those are derived by the PRO, um, but it really depends on the particular regime that we're talking about. Oregon, for example, does have eco-modulation in place for the use of uh, life cycle analysis for particular packaging. And if I remember correctly, those are set by regulation. Like the discount quantity is set by regulation. So in those cases where the regulations set out, if you do this, you get this percent discount. That does exist in some of these laws, but largely speaking, it would actually be by the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, working internally to start proposing, this is what it will look like. These are the factors we're going to include. They may or may not make that math subject to comment or provide it to folks. CAA just had a webinar on their eco-modulation proposal for Oregon, so it's worth taking a look at that and seeing what they're in the works on. But if I remember correctly, those need to only be submitted to Oregon DEQ. I don't know that Oregon DEQ necessarily approves the proposal. So take a look and see, to what extent they're making those available to folks for comment. And if you're a member of CAA, taking advantage of those opportunities to engage as well.
Great. Thanks, James. That was helpful. Okay. Well, we'll give it another few seconds. If you have another question, we're here, or hold your peace. Well, I want to thank you so much, James. That was fantastic, robust. I feel like we all have a better grasp on this moving forward as a result of your presentation, so appreciate that.
Of course, happy to do it, and I appreciate the invitation.
Yes, thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, everybody out there who joined us this afternoon. Again, we will shoot this out your way in the next 24 hours or so, and always follow up with me if you have any other questions. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, James.
Bye.